And more than a decade after US-led forces invaded Iraq, there is a legacy of horrific birth defects. Scientists blame the weapons being used by the US military. Now, the town of Fallujah is the best-known example. The number affected there is 14 times higher than in Hiroshima. Of course, that's where the atomic bomb was dropped at the end of the Second World War. But RT's Lucy Kafanoff was the first to take an in-depth look at the lesser-known extent of the human suffering in the town of Najaf.
Najaf, 160 kilometers south of Baghdad, the sacred Shiite city is known for its holy shrines and is surrounded by one of the largest cemeteries in the world. Some of the heaviest fighting of the Iraq War took place amid these graves. Its legacy still haunts the residents. Ahmed was born with severe birth defects. He's only 8 months old, but the doctors don't expect him to live past his first birthday.
I felt dizzy when I heard the news. I ran out of the doctor's office and into a taxi.
But for his mother, Layla, there's no escaping the reality. Her son has a nervous system disorder, and his muscles are slowly wasting away. It's a recurring nightmare for Layla and her husband. 3 of their children were also born with congenital deformities. None of them survived. And while they don't have proof, they believe radioactive ammunition used by American forces during the war is to blame.
The war isn't over. Yes, the Americans are gone, but we're still suffering from the consequences.
Spiraling numbers of birth defects and high miscarriage rates have also been recorded in Fallujah and Basra, where American and British forces used heavy munitions at the start of the war. But our visit to Najaf revealed that the phenomenon may be far more widespread in Iraq than previously known. Dr. Sundance Saif is one of the few scientists who's been documenting cancer and birth defects here, and she says Najaf is in the midst of a growing health catastrophe.
After the Iraq War, rates of cancer, leukemia and birth defects rose dramatically in Najaf. The areas affected by fighting saw the biggest increases. We believe it's because of the illegal weapons like depleted uranium. At the hospitals here, cancer is more common than the flu.
Depleted uranium, or DU, cuts through armor like a hot knife does through butter. More than 400 tons of it is estimated to have been used in the 2 Iraq wars, the vast majority by U.S. forces. The Pentagon did not respond to our request for comment, but the military generally denies any link between DU exposure and cancer or birth defects. It also says DU weapons are only used to penetrate enemy tanks, but a new report funded by the Norwegian government found that DU was used against civilian targets in populated areas, including Najaf in 2003. It notes a lack of transparency by coalition forces over the use of depleted uranium, but describes one incident in Najaf where a Bradley armored fighting vehicle fired 305 DU rounds in a single engagement. The heavy fighting may be over, but on nearly every street we visited in this neighborhood, multiple cases of cancer and children with deformities. No one knows what's making people here sick. The families want answers, and they want help. Yusuf is old enough for school, but has to be cared for as if he's a toddler. He can't walk, he can't speak, he can't even go to the bathroom on his own. Yusuf's brother is healthy, but the family has buried 2 other children, one severely deformed, the other with a hole in her spine. Like many of the couples in this city, they're simply too afraid to have another baby, and they're left feeling totally abandoned.
No one cares about what's happening to us or the other families in this area. Even our own government doesn't do anything to help. What can we do? This is our fate.
It's a fate that many in Najaf suffer in silence. Countless Iraqis lost their lives in the decades since the U.S.-led invasion. All across the country, their memories are honored in cemeteries like this one. The dead may be the most visible reminder of the human cost of the war, but it's the living victims of that war's toxic legacy who are still paying the price. Lucy Kafanoff, RT, Najaf, Iraq.
Doctors also fear depleted uranium weapons have caused the spread of diseases not previously seen in Iraq. And Iraqi government statistics show that cancer rates as well have also been rising steadily since the first Gulf War of 1991. But Lucy Kafanoff spoke to my colleague Matt Trezor, saying that it's still very difficult to gauge the full extent of these problems.
We've heard about the depleted uranium, the birth defect story coming out of Fallujah, for example, because there's been several TV pieces and print reports talking about and showing. In fact, we here in RT have showed the birth defects in the city of Fallujah. What we were completely stunned by is the fact that this is happening in many more cities that have been previously reported, including Najaf, where we visited. When we showed up, our filming crew and I on the ground in the city, literally every single residential street that we visited in several neighborhoods, we found multiple cases of families who had children who were ill, families who had lost children, had to bury children, families who had many relatives who were suffering from cancer. And while these people can't necessarily prove that it was depleted uranium or the causes of these diseases, this is something that they say has risen dramatically in the years since the invasion.
How widespread is it? I mean, how far across the country?
The problem is that nobody knows exactly, and that's because there haven't been large-scale studies done. We haven't seen big teams of international doctors, for example, going in and sort of looking at different cities, comparing the number of birth defect cases between the different cities. There really simply are no reliable statistics for birth defects in Iraq, and so nobody can really say exactly how big this problem is. And the big problem with the Iraqi government as well, one of the surprising things that we found in speaking to the doctors on the ground is they say that they reportedly have been discouraged by the government from talking out openly about this to the press. In fact, the biologist that we had spoken to in Najaf, who was researching the issue in the city, had to give us the interview in the privacy of her home on the roof there instead of in her laboratory. She said that there is an active sort of push by the government, perhaps not to embarrass the coalition forces, not to really talk about this issue, which we were really quite surprised by. We tried to visit the hospital in Najaf that was dealing with some of the victims, some of the deformed birth defect children. They didn't let us come in. They didn't let us film. In fact, they didn't even let us do interviews with the families or the doctors working there at all. The Iraqi officials certainly have not put in the resources that they could be. We spoke to families in Najaf who said they've gone to local officials. You know, they've asked for help. They've essentially told to sit by. You know, it's a really sad story.
And we spoke to Dr. Chris Busby. He's researched the effects of depleted uranium extensively. He told us what he learned after visiting Fallujah to see how the civilians there have been affected.
We went to Fallujah and we found the levels of congenital malformation and cancer, and we looked at the parents of the children with congenital malformation, and we did analysis of their hair to see what was inside their hair that might be genotoxic, might be the sort of thing that could cause congenital malformation. And the only thing that we found was uranium. We found uranium in the hair of the mothers of the children with congenital malformations. Now that we know that uranium is genotoxic, that it causes these levels of genetic damage, and because of that it also causes cancer. So you can work slowly back from that towards uranium. Now the only source of uranium was the use by the American forces, the American-led forces, of uranium weapons. Not only depleted uranium weapons, but as we later found out, slightly enriched uranium weapons, which we believe they were using in order to cover their tracks. So I think we have more or less proved that these effects are a result of the use during the two wars of uranium and the particles that the uranium weapons produced.